uh, and I'm warning you that it is going to be uncomfortable at times. There are others of you that are going to be uncomfortable because you do not agree with what I say. In fact, it is going to make you feel things like guilt or shame or anxiety or fear or that you just don't like me. And I'm okay with that. I don't expect everyone to walk out being an Adam Foss fan at the end of this talk. That's not why I'm here. I am here hoping that when you do feel uncomfortable, that you just pause for a moment and ask yourself where that discomfort is coming from. And recognize that being uncomfortable is something that we should enjoy and lean into, because when we need to get to a bigger and better version of ourselves, regardless if that is learning a new skill, if that is getting six-pack abs, if that is learning a new language, if that is learning how to cook, if that is doing anything that involves self-improvement, that involves some level of consistent discomfort. If you went to your personal trainer and said, "Hey man, I need some, I want some six-pack abs," and you left the gym every day in absolute comfort, you should be getting your money back. And so I'm hoping that you can see discomfort as a challenge that will bring you to something that is better. I also am going to ask you not to do the things that we do when we're uncomfortable. Please don't get distracted by what's going on your phone or what's going on your screen or what's going on your television or whatever else is going on in your home. Don't look for the exit, and please, please, please don't think of the "yeah, but I don't agree with him" response that we typically do when we feel uncomfortable. Just sit in your discomfort for a little while. And I ask you to do that not because I'm a sadist, but because it is a privilege to remove yourself from discomfort. There are lots of people who wake up every single morning who are living in abject poverty that will spend their day in discomfort, and they do not have the privilege just to leave it because they don't feel right. There are people who wake up with a certain amount of melanin in their skin and they feel uncomfortable all day. There are people who wake up and because who they identify their gender to be, who they've chosen to love or who they've chosen to worship, they feel uncomfortable all day long. And they do not have the privilege to leave that. So I'm asking you, if you hear something that makes you feel uncomfortable, please just have the moment to pause, ask yourself, why is that making me uncomfortable? And just sit in it, because it'll be over soon. And to start this uncomfortable conversation, I want to talk about my travel habits. There are lots of things wrong with our criminal justice system, but I'm going to focus on one thing today, and that is the disparities that we see across the board in our system. And that's because one of the presenters this morning was talking about this idea of trust. And instead of seeing the reality of racial disparities or ethnic disparities or gender disparities in our criminal justice system as an indictment on us as individuals, we have to recognize that those disparities drive trust away from our system. And so I'm going to talk about have an uncomfortable conversation about racial disparities today. And I'm going to start that conversation talking about my travel habits. And for those of you who had joined us for the Nebraska District Attorneys Association conversation last month, I'm really glad you're back. I'm sorry that you have to hear this talk again. I hope you enjoyed the as much as you did last time. Up until the coronavirus struck, I was traveling in airplanes all of the time. And in fact, in 2018, I spent only 17 nights in my own bed. The rest of the time was spent in hotels and airplanes. And when you're traveling that much, I traveled 2.5 million miles in 3 years. When you are traveling that much, you achieve something that all of us are constantly striving for, which is status. And by the time this event that I'm going to tell you about happened, I was like triple, quadruple, platinum, mint, all black, everything status. And what that status allowed me to do is get on the plane whatever I want and sit wherever I want. And I happen to be an aisle person. I like sitting in the aisle. I also like getting on the plane first. I like making sure that there's place overhead to store my bag because I've lost too many on the underbelly of the plane. And on this particular day, I was sitting in my aisle seat when a young woman came and she said, "Excuse me, I have to sit down." And so I stood up and she sat down. And I went back to reading my book, and a few minutes later, a young man came and said, "Excuse me, I have to sit down." And so I stood up and he sat down. And my row was full, and as we were taxiing around the runway and we were taking off, I was looking out the window, looking out whatever landscape I was flying from that day, I don't remember. But I do remember the moment that happened when I was looking across these two strangers' faces outside my window. I realized in that moment that despite the fact that I had flown 3 million miles in the last 3 years, this was the first time that I had sat next to two black people on an airplane. And for some of you, that might mean absolutely nothing. For others of you, you might know exactly what I'm talking about because I have the unfortunate experience of having to count and recognize when I'm the only person that looks like me in a given environment. And those environments, particularly, are environments of privilege and power and opportunity. And I think about an airplane as a microcosm of a place of privilege and power and opportunity. And I do that because air travel was not a thing that was available to my family as a child. In fact, I didn't get on an airplane until I was in high school. And when I did, I remember thinking, like, man, my family made it. And so while I was looking at few, if any, people who look like me, I think about I've had the opportunity to speak at about 120 colleges, universities, law schools, and graduate schools in the last 4 years. And until last year, I had yet to go to one that had an African American population of 5% or greater. I reflect on the fact that in the last 4 years, I've had the opportunity to sit in some of the Fortune 100 companies' C-suite offices, sitting across from Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos. And these offices where millions of dollars are being exchanged. And when I look around those offices for people who look like me, typically the only people I see who look like me are serving the coffee or taking out the trash. I've had the opportunity to speak at some of the best conferences that this planet has to offer. TED, Davos, Skoll, Nantucket Project, Patal, you name it, I've been there standing on those stages, looking out at audiences of people who've paid tens of thousands of dollars for these tickets because of the access that you get at these conferences to philanthropy and to business people and to celebrities. And when I'm looking out off that stage into these audiences, looking for people who look like me, typically the people who look like me in those audiences are the musical talent. And when I'm looking around these spaces of extreme power and privilege and opportunity, and I don't see anyone who looks like me, I'm left with two choices. Either one, the people who are in these homogenous spaces are just that much more articulate and ambitious and driven and creative and hardworking than me, or something else is happening. And I don't really have to dwell in that place too much time because the rest of my time I spend in places of absolute despair. In prisons and juvenile detention facilities, in homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters, in impoverished neighborhoods and in courthouses. And when I'm in those places and I'm looking around, I see a disproportionate number of people who look like me. And again, when I'm looking around in these places of abject despair and I see this disproportionate amount of people who look like me, I'm left with two choices. Either there's something fundamentally wrong with me. There's something different about me and people who look like me that make it more likely that we end up in those places as opposed to the places of power, privilege, and opportunity. Or something else is happening. And I don't have to dwell in that space for much longer either because I've had the opportunity to talk to lots of people who look like me in those places of power, privilege, and opportunity. And let me just get it really, really clear. When I'm saying people who look like me, I'm not just talking about like light-skinned, good-looking dudes with long dreads and beards. I'm talking about marginalized people. Rural people who are in your community, indigenous people who are in your community, black and brown people who are in your community, marginalized poor people who are in your community. When I look around in these spaces of abject despair, I meet people all the time who are wildly intelligent, wildly driven, wildly ambitious, wildly creative, but they don't get the opportunity to be in these other places of privilege and power. And to me, regardless of who your candidate is, when I take a step back and I think about what is going on in this country right now, I start asking questions about my legacy and what I'm allowing to happen while I'm left here on this earth. And when I think about my legacy, I think about like, what are people going to be saying about me 50 years from now? About what I did with my time, with my power on this planet, this platform that I built. And the only way that I can do that, the only way that I can like conceptualize what people will be saying about me 50 years from now is to think about the way that I think about people who treated people who look like me 50 years ago. And the only way that I can do that is look at images of the way that people treated people who look like me 50 years ago. When I'm looking at those images, I think about the images of four little girls who went into a Sunday school one day and never came out again because a pipe bomb went off in their church and nothing happened for decades. I think about the images of a 15-year-old boy who was beaten so badly that his mother had the wherewithal to keep his casket open during his funeral so the rest of the country could see what the Deep South had done to her son. I think about the images of three young men lit on fire, hanging from trees in the middle of the public square of a major city in the 1960s. And when I'm looking at those images, obviously I'm thinking about Emmett Till. Obviously I'm thinking about those four little girls. Obviously I'm thinking about those three young men. But the thing that gets me the most are all of the people standing around in the periphery, watching it happen. I know they're not bad people. They can't all be terrible people, but they're just standing there. And I find myself shouting at the images like, what are you doing? Why are you just standing there? I would have done something. Why aren't you doing anything? But if I'm not too careful, if I'm not thinking every day about how I'm either contributing to the problem or the solution, there's a chance that I might be one of those people standing in the periphery 50 years from now in images if you take snapshots of the way that our country looks right now. And I'm not going to talk about the political stuff right now. What I'm going to talk about are just facts, data that we have today. 2.3 million people in jail and prison right now. That number went down a little bit because of COVID, but it's gone right back up again as we filled up our jails. Another 5 million people on probation or parole, one misstep away from that larger aggregate number. Despite the fact that people who look like me make up about 13% of our national population, we're pushing 50% of the correctional population. 1 in 3 black men born today will spend some time in jail or prison. 1 in 6 brown men born today will spend some time in jail or prison. 1 in 3 black women today has a relative in jail or prison. 1 in 3 white children today is in the foster care system, on welfare. And mass incarceration isn't a retention problem. 650,000 people come out of prison every single year just to run into 50,000 collateral consequences of felony convictions that keep them trapped under the very structures that were built to keep them there. 70% of the women on this planet are locked up in this country. 75% of them are mothers, and 50% of them will never see their children again because they made a series of bad decisions that ended their incarceration. And 80% of them who are in prison right now who are reporting it are there because they were victims of abuse, either sexual or physical or both. 70% of the children locked up in this planet are locked up here, and we are the only country that doles out life sentences to children. 1 in 4 of us has a criminal record. That's 70 million Americans walking around out here with a scarlet letter on our chest that somehow we're less valuable to the economy and to society because we got caught doing something, typically when you're young people. And this isn't just a criminal justice issue. These disparities show up at every political and social and economic and health and educational metric you can possibly think of. The leading cause of death of young black men in this country, 18 to 35 years old, is handgun homicide. It causes so much death, it causes more death than the next 9 leading causes of death combined. Why? Because unless you believe that I was born with a genetic deficiency that makes it more likely that I pick up a handgun and shoot somebody that looks like me, then something else is going on here. Black women and white women experience breast cancer at the exact same incident rates, but black women are twice as likely to die from it. Black women and white women experience cervical cancer at the exact same incident rates, but black women are 71% more likely to die from it. Why? Because black women wake up in this country caring half as much about their bodies, or is something else happening? The average household worth of white families in Boston, that city that I grew up in, is $250,000 a year and increasing. The average household worth of black families in Boston is $8 and decreasing. Why? Because after World War II, people who look like me didn't want to go and get their hands on some real property and transfer that real property to the generations after they come that come after them to inherit wealth, or is something else happening? There are more segregated schools in this country today than there were on the evening of Brown versus Board of Education. There are more people of color under correctional control today than there were slaves on the eve of the Civil War. And if I have to draw the finest point on it that I possibly can, researchers estimate that in the 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, 12 million Africans were captured, enslaved, and killed. Last year, 13 million people went through our jails, costing us trillions of dollars just to run the system, but also in all of the lost revenue that we had, because this is a tremendous waste of our money. Why? Because in 3 years, 70% of those people will be right back in the system. And you would think that for all of this expenditure, we spend the most on policing, we spend the most on prosecution, we spend the most on prison, you'd think that we'd get something for that return on investment. And we do. We are currently ranked 128th safest country to live on the planet, right between Saudi Arabia and Rwanda. And the real trick of it is, it's the places that we spend the most amount on policing, prosecution, and prison that we have the most amount of crime. Is that because the people in those places just happen to be more criminal than those who live in the suburbs and the affluent neighborhoods that I got to grow up in? Or is something else happening here? This is legacy making time. That is the state of our union, no matter how you look at it. That is what we are dealing with. And on the other end of that, we have a bunch of people who pay our bills, who pay our salaries, who do not trust us. This is our legacy. And our legacy, unfortunately, is one of the greatest in human. This has never happened on this planet before. And it's happening on our watch. And if we don't solve the problem pretty quickly, we're going to be handing it off to another generation of young people who want to come out and do great things for this planet. And so it's incumbent upon us, the people who showed up today, to do something about it right now. We need a new civil rights movement. I don't know why the last one stopped. A lot of people blame the lack of the inertia on the lack of leadership. We're waiting for the next Malcolm, the next Martin, the next Rosa, anyone to come and take us to the promised land, but it doesn't come. And every day that we wait, millions more of us are arrested, thousands more of us incarcerated, thousands more of us dying. We cannot wait any longer. And we certainly cannot continue denying that there is a problem. That is why, when I was offered the opportunity to come and speak to you today, I jumped at it. Because despite the fact I cannot see you, I know out there somewhere are the new civil rights leaders of our time, and all you got to do is make a choice. Talk about that in a minute. I remember when I was 19 years old, and I was handing a police officer thousands of dollars of cash that I had stuffed up into the wall of my bedroom. And I remember handing him the little scraps of marijuana that I had left over from the pounds that I was trafficking between Philadelphia and Boston. And I remember looking at him and him looking at me, and me registering the look on his face of one of contempt and disgust and frustration that I had become a statistic. And I remember looking at him and thinking to myself, like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. But despite the fact that I was a black man in the United States of America, standing across from a police officer, I was born in a violent, impoverished neighborhood. I was immediately orphaned. motorcycles. He convinced two men from two different communities in the suburbs to drive up to our neighborhood and to pick up Stanley and his accomplice. He then convinced those two men to drive to the back of an abandoned golf course to test drive the motorcycles. And when they got out to the back of that abandoned golf course, as the men were taking those motorcycles off the trucks, Stanley's accomplice lifted up his jacket, revealing what appeared to be a firearm. And Stanley would invite those men to get back into their trucks and leave, and they did. Stanley then got on those motorcycles, drove them back behind that same fence, that same chop shop, and walked out with a substantial amount of money. We had gone from cell phone stealing to Vespa theft to 2 counts of armed robbery, 2 counts of possession of a firearm, 2 counts of assault with a dangerous weapon, and 2 victims. One of those charges was a life felony. You stack all 6 of those on top of each other, there aren't enough numbers to describe how long Stanley was facing. And there I was, Mr. Woke Prosecutor, and I had nothing left to say. So I took it as an opportunity to do what I hadn't been doing, to ask Stanley what was happening. I asked the court officer to bring him up out of lockup. I asked him to take all his hardware off. He had come in that courtroom that day with ankle shackles on, handcuffs and a waist chain all tied together in the middle in an orange jumpsuit. It was the first time that I had seen Stanley out of his street clothes, and it was jarring to see how little he looked in all that gear. And I took him into a conference room with his attorney, and I asked him a simple question: what happened? And for those of you who are working intimately in the system, it might strike you as odd that a prosecutor would be interviewing the defendant on the day of his arraignment about some really, really serious charges. But don't worry. Don't worry. I wasn't investigating the case. In fact, I had every shred of evidence at that time that I needed to bury Stanley underneath the prison. You see, Stanley wasn't very good at committing the crime that he committed. He used his own email address, stanleyvargas98@gmail.com, to set up the Craigslist purchase. He used his own cell phone to text the men his address to pick him up. And if that wasn't bad enough, when Stanley got on those motorcycles, he looked so good that he couldn't help taking a picture of himself and posting it on the internet. Date, time, and location stamping himself at the scene of the crime on the evidence. So this wasn't me trying to investigate what had been done. In fact, I really just wanted to know, like, how did I miss this? How did we get here so quickly? Stanley didn't tell me about any gang he was trying to jump into. He didn't tell me about any gang he was trying to jump out of. He didn't tell me about some weird international motorcycle stealing ring that was fueling drug trafficking, sex trafficking, and guns and heroin. He told me about when he was 9 years old and his family emigrated from the Dominican Republic to give him a city in the Northeast where they didn't speak the language and they were strangers. And how at 9 years old, despite the fact that he'd grown up in a developing nation, he'd never seen the kind of violence and poverty and trauma that he started to experience very shortly after they moved to the Fidelis Projects in Boston. And how that violence and that poverty and trauma started to seep through the cracks of their apartment building and take his family members one by one. First, it came for his oldest brother. Stanley loved his oldest brother, worshipped him. He was attractive, he was fun, he was smart, he was athletic. But shortly after they moved to the United States, Stanley's oldest brother stopped coming home after school. And then he stopped coming home after curfew, and sometimes he wouldn't come home at all. Stanley would see him out in the street and he'd be dressed in all nice gear, and Stanley wouldn't know where it came from until one day the federal government made that very clear when they kicked in the front door of Stanley's apartment building and took Stanley's brother and sent him to federal prison for drug trafficking at the age of 19. Same thing that I had been doing. Next, Stanley lost his next oldest brother, Stephen. Stephen and Stanley were very close in age, and they used to play together all the time. But shortly after they moved to the United States, that play became roughhousing, and that roughhousing became violence, and that violence began to manifest on other members of Stanley's family, and then kids at school, and then finally people in the street. Stanley described Stephen as a little off, but his parents were reluctant to go get him the mental health treatment that he probably needed because they were undocumented and they were afraid what would happen if they brought them to the doctor. Stephen decompensated until at some point he was involved in a gang shooting and he went to state prison at age 18. Stanley told me about finding out that his father had disappeared in the middle of the night, a broken and ashamed man who had sacrificed everything, including his very good job, to move to the United States to give his family a chance at the American dream, only to expose them to our American nightmare, the criminal justice system. Stanley told me about finding his mother on the ground one afternoon crying and throwing up, not because she was sad and not because she was sick, but because she was so exhausted from trying to hold everything together. And Stanley told me about the feeling that he had when he put that $8,000 on his mother's table. The $8,000 that he got from stealing those 2 motorcycles and putting that money on his mother's table and rubbing her back and saying, "I've got you. I'm never going to let anything happen to you. Don't worry, Mom." I said, "Yeah, Stanley, I understand. I understand that. I feel that. I would do anything for my mother. I would do anything for my family. But you gotta know, Stanley, you can't be out here robbing people. You can't be out here with guns. Weren't you afraid of the police? Weren't you afraid of hurting those people? Weren't you afraid of going to prison?" Stanley looked at me and he said, "Is that what you think? Is that really what you think, that when I was out there robbing those men, the threat of prison ever entered my mind? I was worried about my mother dying. I wasn't worried about prison. Do you think that when my friends put guns in the front of our pants to go to school, we're worried about what will happen? We're worried about the 18 months in the House of Corrections that you'll give us if we get caught with a gun? No. We're worried about the very real consequence if we get caught out here without a gun." Stanley sat back in his chair and he said to me, "Bro, the criminal law is for the land of the living. We're just out here trying to survive." The best piece of legal education that I ever got did not come from the $150,000 piece of paper that sits on my wall or some training that I went to. It came from a 17-year-old kid in an orange jumpsuit reading at about a 5th grade level. That is the opportunity that we have, and often the opportunity that we miss, by continuing to tell people that we're not doing anything wrong. It is the opportunity that we have to have the humility to listen to the people who are showing up at our doorstep about how we can do our jobs better so that we can make safer communities. And so I decided to do that in that very moment. I reached down in my pocket and I pulled out my sword and my shield. I said, "Okay, Stanley, I need 2 things from you today. Number 1, I need you to tell me where it is that you want to be. Because right now, those options are pretty limited to state prison for probably 15 to 20 years." Stanley said, "I want to graduate from high school. My family gave up everything so I can graduate. I want to graduate. And you know what else? I want to play baseball. I'm really good at baseball. But because of my brother's reputation at school and my reputation, my grades, nobody's trying to help me with my grades, I can't get on the team. I can't play. I just want to play. And you know what else? I want to go to college. I don't know anyone that's ever been to college except for my lawyer and you. And I want to go to college. And at the end of the day, whether I'm playing pro ball or whether I'm a college graduate, I want to buy my mother a house and get her out of the hood." Please pause for a moment and reflect and ask yourself that if that sounds like the life plan of a violent and serial felon that needed to go to prison for 15 years that day. I didn't think so either. So the next question I asked Stanley was for a list of all the things that he needed to do to get from where he is right now to where it is that you want to be, Stanley. I'm going to write you a list too. I'm the prosecutor. There are certain things that I need from you. And Stanley wrote his list, and it looks something like this. Wake up on time, eat a good breakfast, go to school, stay in school, study, pay attention, do my homework, practice hard, play hard, win, be nice to my friends, be nice to my mom, be nice to strangers, stay away from the police, don't be a pain in the ass, do good. My list looked remarkably similar. But at the top, number one, we're going to go get the victim's stuff back. See, the intervention was happening within hours of the crime, and as a result, I was able to work with Stanley and the Boston Police Department and go get those 2 motorcycles back and give them back to the victim, something that we can almost never achieve in the criminal justice system. Number 2, you're going to apologize, Stanley. Not in the way where 18 months from now we're going to negotiate down to you taking accountability and you're going to stand over there and I'm going to stand here and I'm going to read the facts out the police report and you're going to say, yeah, I did that. No. You're going to apologize with your words to these men, and if these men won't have you, we'll find other people who have been harmed in a similar manner, because I need you to understand the harm that you caused. I need you to understand that just by giving their stuff back, you have not been able to restore their feeling of safety, and they will not feel safe until they are convinced that you will never do this again. That's called restorative justice, Stanley. And restorative justice isn't about your words, it's about your actions. Accountability is about showing that you understand through your actions, and you're going to do that by doing community service every single day until your hands bleed. And I'm not talking about the kind of community service where you're going to get on the bus with the OGs and go pick up trash on the side of the highway. I'm talking about community service at a community-based organization that you can put on a resume and be proud of. But don't worry, there's going to be an adult that'll get you there, that loves you, that wants to see you succeed. Anytime that there's an academic lecture or book reading that I want you to go to, you're going to go, but don't worry, there's going to be an adult that will get you there, that loves you, that wants to see you succeed. Anytime that there's a documentary screening that I want you to go to, you're going to go, and don't worry, there's going to be an adult that will get you there, that wants to see you succeed. You're going to write, you're going to reflect, you're going to essay, you're going to journal, you're going to talk to me about this case, because I need you to understand with every fiber of your being the harm that you caused and the way that you're going to repair it. And I also need you to understand that you are not the worst thing that you've ever done. And you're going to do that every day until I say stop, and I'll say stop when you've crossed that first finish line that you set for yourself. When you graduate from high school, I'll be standing there saying, congratulations, Stanley Vargas. Your case is over. But for now, you're going to go home. And Stanley walked out. That's one example of me exercising my sword and my shield, and it all started with a conversation with a person who would come into our system. And having tens of thousands of those conversations with people who are in our system, as opposed to just doing what I was doing, which was acting like because I had this degree I was smarter than them and I just could talk over them, I learned a ton. And one of the most important things that I learned is that a lot of this is predictable and therefore preventable, particularly with young people. Because of what I've learned from everyone, victims of crime, people who are just going into the system, all the way up to people who are serving life sentences, is that very few of them chose to live this life as opposed to the life that I get to enjoy. That very few of them wake up in the morning intent on hurting someone else. That they've been harmed many, many times over their lives, and most of the crime that we see is a manifestation of that harm because we have not resolved it. We know now that children conceived to mothers who are living in poverty, living in toxic stress, inherit that toxic stress as they're developing. After they are born, they respond differently to stimuli, they respond differently to trauma, they respond differently to cognitive ability. And unfortunately, many of those children end up in our prisons. Those are unborn children telling us, hey, if you use your resources down here, and they start suffering that toxic stress acutely. We call them adverse childhood experiences, and I'm sure this crowd knows all about childhood experiences, but in the event that there's anybody out there that doesn't know about childhood experiences, we could have a whole other conference just about those and their connection to our work, but we don't have time for that, so let me do the really, really quick version. The more adverse childhood experiences you have, the more likely it is that we are going to see you. exposure to violence, to domestic violence, to substance abuse, to divorce, to incarcerated parents, to poverty. Not choices that these children are making, choices that are made for them. In fact, in 2015, the juvenile detention facilities in Massachusetts surveyed all of their kids, and they learned that 75% of them had, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system before the age of 3. Let me say that again. 75% of children in Massachusetts detention facilities have, on average, 3 interactions with the child welfare system before the age of 3 for abuse, neglect, and malnutrition. Those are little kids telling us, hey, if you use your sword and your shield down here, if you use your resources down here, you might save me from going to prison, but we don't. We wait. Those children then go on to the first grade in their communities, and by the time they've reached the first grade in their communities, they've heard 30 million fewer words than kids in more affluent communities, and I'm talking about the communities that you and I are living in. They've been read to, on average, 18 hours by the time they reach the first grade, and kids in more affluent communities have been read to, on average, 1,000 hours by the time they reach the first grade. That gap in cognition, that gap in literacy development, that gap in showing a kid that you love them enough to sit down with them for an hour a day and read to them leads to early problems in school, early interactions with the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, and prison. I ask you, how many of the young people that you are working with are reading at or near grade level? Those kids then enter the next developmental phase in our life. After they've asked us, hey, use your sword and your shield down here. Use your resources down here. Read to me down here. You might save me from going to prison. We don't. We wait. And they enter this next phase of their life where we're judging them on their ability to learn how to learn from reading. We never talk about this developmental moment, this developmental milestone in the life of children, but it's really important because it's how we're evaluated for the rest of our lives. And sadly, for lots of our kids, when they reach that milestone, they have not been given the tools to succeed, not because they're black or brown or indigenous or poor or queer or stupid, but because nobody read to them, because nobody gave them the tools, because when they were acting up, nobody had the patience to sit down and ask them what's wrong. And when you're 8, 9, and 10 years old and you're getting evaluated for a skill that you're not picking up, not because you're dumb, but because you didn't have the faculties, it's frustrating. And that frustration manifests in behavior because children don't have the language to articulate the frustration that they're feeling, the disconnect that they're feeling. They act up, they act out, they run around the class, they're the class clown, they're the class problem. And what do we do as adults? What do we do as adults who know that if we don't keep them in this building, if we don't get them across the finish line, we dramatically increase the likelihood that they go to the criminal justice system? What do? We label them. We shame them. We suspend and expel them. Racial disparities in this country around suspension and detention start in preschool. If you suspend a black boy in this country one time between the ages of 8 and 12, you've increased the likelihood that they drop out by 50%. 70% of the men doing life sentences in this country are high school dropouts. I'm not a statistician, but there is a causal relationship somewhere in there. Those are little kids saying, hey, if you use your resources down here, if you use your sword and your shield down here, if you spend a little bit more money down here, you might save me from going to prison, but we don't. We wait. Those kids receive that message that we're receiving in school every single day. You're a bad kid. You're not smart. You're not valuable. You're a bad kid. Your life doesn't matter. You're a bad kid. You're a bad kid. Those are the good kids. Those are what the good kids look like. Those are the grades the good kids get. That's what the good kids do. You're a bad kid. And they receive this message every day going to school, at school, after school, and sadly for lots of these kids at home. And they hear it until they reach the next developmental milestone in their life, the milestone that we know is adolescence, the time in our lives when we are biologically engineered to determine who it is that we're going to be for the rest of our lives. And we do that by taking data from the outside world, internalizing it, finding other kids who are just like us, and rejecting lots and lots of other folks, especially adult authority. It is a natural and adaptive means of growing up, and we love it when the good kids do it. We love reflecting on our old days about how we used to be little rascals. We love when the good kids find ways to find other kids who are just like them and team up with them, whether it's the football team or the dance troupe or the drama club or the debate club or the math team or the science team or the goth kids. We love it when they do that. But at the same time, lots of kids who have found no value in school, lots of kids who have felt no place of belonging in school, decide not to come back to the building anymore. They disengage and then they're out in the wind, but that biological need to find other kids like them isn't relieved, and so they do. They find other kids who are just like them, disassociated from school, disaffected by all of us, and we have a label for that too. We call that a gang. And unfortunately, for a lot of these young people, that gang is the first time they felt anything that feels like safety or support or accountability or loyalty or responsibility. And when someone visits violence on that gang and that young person responds with violence, not because they're black or brown or immigrant or indigenous or poor, but because they've been living in violence from the time that we were born and we have not listened to their cries for help. Because for many of our young people, particularly in the urban corridors, it's easier for them to get a handgun than it is to get a job. In our rural communities, it's easier for them to get methamphetamine and heroin than it is to get a job. Because for many of these young people, they've lost more friends to overdosing or to violence than any combat veteran coming back from Afghanistan or Iraq. Because they are living in persistent trauma. And our answer to that, when they do finally do that violent thing that we don't want them to, then as adults we say, okay, young person, now I see you. Now I'll pay attention to you. Now you have my undivided attention. I will spend all of my resources to find you, prosecute you, and lock you up for the rest of your life. Shame on you. In my state of Massachusetts, it costs us $11 million to hang on to this kid until he dies. But that is how we choose to invest our money. Because the thought of taking that $11 million, even a fraction of that money, and putting it somewhere else in the life of that boy is met with comments like, what are you, communists? What are you, socialists? What are you, Marxists? What are you, welfare? Affirmative action? Shame on you. That's what we've decided that our legacy is going to be. That fundamental cost-benefit analysis is where we are right now as a country. And each and every one of us has the opportunity, the responsibility to do something about it, and we can. The next time that we are confronted with a young person and their family that comes to our door, regardless of who they are and what we think of them. It's legacy making time right now. And you don't even have to do it for all altruistic reasons. You can even do it just because when you do it and you get it right, it feels incredible. Shortly before my meeting with Obama, I had a much more important meeting. I sat with a young man as he signed his letter of intent to play Division III baseball at a college in New Hampshire. A few months after that meeting, I had a text message from that young man. He said, I did it, bro. Playing a trick on me, and I said, why, Stanley? Until that point, Finally, last year, the Massachusetts Bar Association gave me this really, really nice award. They gathered 6,000 people from around my state to this conference room in Boston. And in preparing for the event, they asked me, "Hey, can you get a famous person, get like John Legend or Chappelle or Obama, someone cool, someone influential, to introduce you to give you the award?" And I said, "Sure." I brought Stanley. Stanley stood before 6,000 of my colleagues, and he gave a short but brilliant speech during which he informed the crowd that he had been scouted by the Philadelphia Phillies, the New York Yankees, and the Boston Red Sox, but he was seriously considering going to law school because he wanted to become a prosecutor because he thought he could do a better job than me. And I agree with him because when he was sitting in front of me in his orange jumpsuit, handcuffs, and ankle shackles, he was much more equipped to be making decisions about what happened in his community than I was. And Stanley became my mentor. That is the opportunity that all of us have every single day if we have the humility and the bravery to let it happen. And we have to. Because 50 years from now, people are going to be looking at snapshots at this time. They're going to be looking back at those images, and they're going to be looking at all of us, and they're going to be thinking to themselves, like, what did you do? Number one in mass incarceration, number one in racial and ethnic disparities everywhere that you look, number one at handgun suicides, number one at opioid deaths. What were you doing? Why are you just standing there? I would have done something. Why aren't you doing something? And when people are asking those questions of you 50 years from now, how is it that you want to be remembered? Because in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, in the future, it's not the words of your enemies you remember, it's the silence of your friends. So in 50 years from now, when people are asking those questions to you, do you want to be remembered as someone who heard the dramatic feedback that we are getting from the communities that we are prosecuting and policing, who are saying, please do it differently, and say, nothing to see here, no problem? Are you going to look around and think, there's nothing that I can do about this? Are you going to think about your power and think, no, there's nothing I can change? Do you want to be remembered as someone who remains silent? Or do you want to be remembered as someone who today did something different? Who today set your course for a different North Star, one that sees public safety as the premium, and we get there by trusting the people who are in our communities, not being afraid of them, listening to them, not telling them what to do? Do you want to be someone who gave voice to the voiceless, power to the powerless? Do you want to be remembered as one of the new civil rights leaders of our time? Do you want to be remembered as someone who, when the going got tough, you pulled out your sword and your shield? I guarantee you, no matter where you are in 50 years from now, if you choose the latter, if you choose to join my gang, I don't care where you are in 50 years from now, you'll be remembered as one of the happiest, wealthiest people that's ever lived. Thank you very much. All right. First thing I'm going to do, put my contact information in the chat. It's my email and my social media. Please, for those of you who have questions, Jenny, I think we just do it in the chat. Is that right? So we have this time for Q&A, and then I have a breakout session later on, some point after a break. But I'm really, really interested in hearing your questions in this space, and hope that you can join us for that breakout, which will be a little bit more strategy-based. But I'd love to hear questions from the crowd, particularly those of you who found yourself in some discomfort, who found yourself being challenged by what I had to say. I don't want softball questions. I want the hard ones. But we can start off with softball ones. If you got them, please put them in the chat. Be brave. That's what we're here for. I got a question about my art. It's the only question I've gotten today so far. Any curriculum or literature recommendations for working with teens and younger mentees? Great question, Josh. Thank you. Um, it's a little dated at this point in time, but for me, as a prosecutor who's introduced this book, it really changed the game. It's called The Age of Opportunity by Lawrence Steinberg. This was like my gateway drug for understanding adolescent brain development in a way that was not um, it was not offered to me at any other point. Like it wasn't offered to me in law school, that's for sure. But I was fortunate to be in the right place, at the right time. I got this book, and once I read it, all the other channels just opened up. And so, learning, starting that with that as your foundation, and then reading other books. Hold on, we're just going to go over to my bookshelf really quickly because we're live here. My Grandmother's Hands recently came out this year. It's a good one to read. The Body Keeps Score is another great book for you to read. Learning the foundation of adolescent brain development is really important. Then adding the layer of understanding adolescent brain development through the lens of trauma is like where we need to take it. And so, really understanding those two things is super important. Pasca, I saw your question. How can Lincoln invest in Stanley's? The first question we have to ask is like, what are we investing in that's not working? And I'm not a defund the police person. I am a return on investment person. And we have to really seriously look around at our return on investment for things. I live in the city of Los Angeles. We spend $500 million on policing. Most of the expense is spent on something else. 1.8% of our calls to 911 are for violent crime. The rest of it is for other stuff. 44% of the time, police are responding to 911s. It's actually a non-emergency. And so if that money was going to 3 and 4 or 5 years old, that, like, let's just start having real conversations about ROI. My dad's a cop. None of this is about being anti-law enforcement. I don't know how we got to a place where we hear the words, see me as a whole human being, Black Lives Matter, don't kill me, and we got to anti-cop. We really have to think about when our emotions get in the way of what's best for everyone, and that is an ROI conversation to me. What are your thoughts on adult developmental relationships? Andrew, I'm going to ask you to just clarify that a little bit more, because that term, adult developmental relationships, could mean a few things. Alice, how do I challenge other people's thinking and perceptions and challenge myself as well? That's a great question, and thank you for acknowledging that we all still need to be challenged. It's really, really easy for us to, particularly like woke people, to think that we've got it all figured out and that we don't have to do like work every single day. A lot of these disparities show up from behavior that we are manifesting. We don't even know that it's happening. They are preconceived ideas and notions that are in our minds, not because we are moral failures, but because we are products of our environment. And a lot of this stuff is put into your brain before the time that you were even old enough to read. And as a result, when you get to be an adult and your brain freezes over with that stuff in there, it takes a lot to get it out. So you have to work at it every single day. And the only way for me to do that, to accelerate that process and to challenge our beliefs, is to have different experiences. I could read all day about diversion and would not have had the faith and belief in it if I didn't just start doing it. And so what I'm saying to you is experiences, particularly experiences that make us uncomfortable, are the ones that lead to the most amount of awakening and challenge. And so visiting juvenile detention facilities as a part of your job as a juvenile prosecutor, must have it. Going to see your victims' homes, particularly those victims who say things like, I don't want to press charges, like, Stop asking those people to come to our buildings to interview them and go out to theirs, and understand that you're not going to get hurt in doing that, and you can protect yourself if you have to. But a lot of our reticence to do that is harming our ability to serve victims. Speak to somebody who has committed a homicide and talk to them about their lives, and hold the two truths to be true: that this person did a horrible thing, but lots of horrible things happened to them, and most likely they were throwing up red flags that they were on this trajectory, and we missed them. Um, Experience to me is the best way that we can go about that. Uh, Jalissa, I work with youth center here. The youth we serve here are immersed in trauma and poverty. I feel like sometimes all I end up with is removing them from the home, in addition to petty theft and fighting. For sure, Jalissa, and this is like a reality that, it's hard for us to. I don't want anybody walking out of here thinking like I'm laying this tremendous amount of responsibility on you to solve all the problems, including the ones at home. What I am asking you to do, though, and this is something that I had to learn, was crime, particularly violence, acts more as a contagious disease than it does like the individual failing of a person that I can deter by being mean to them or harsh on them. Uh, yes, we have a defendant in our case or a client in our case management system, and this is more for the prosecutors and law enforcement folks, because I know that folks who are working in the social service understand sort of the ecosystem of these things and how difficult that can be, but understand that it is cyclical. And so taking people out of the cycle can lead to that not being a problem anymore. So Stanley came from one of those homes, violence and poverty. And because he's now going to graduate from college, because he's been away from that environment for 4 years, and a really important 4 years for his brain, because he has a job waiting for him at the end of his college career, the likelihood that he goes into poverty is very slim. The likelihood he commits another crime is very slim. The likelihood that his children ever experience the criminal justice system is dramatically reduced. And so just understanding the opportunity that we have to break the cycle by doing that. How many Stanleys versus not Stanleys? One case does not a change make. You had three chances and blow it the first two. Randy, I would love to understand a little bit about the spirit of the comment. Because nobody asked me how many people did I send to prison and come out on the other end, and then they went to commit harm. I'm never nobody's ever held accountable for the fact that 70% of the people who are coming through our prisons go out on the other side and hurt someone. And when I started thinking about it in that context, and really I started thinking about it in guns in Massachusetts, if you're caught with a gun, you go to jail for 18 months. Doesn't matter if you're a shooter. Doesn't matter if you're 14 or 20. Doesn't matter if you are holding it for somebody else because you're scared or because you want to be cool or whatever. You go to jail for 18 months, no questions asked. And on the back end of that 18-month sentence, I was almost always left over with something worse than I had gone in, unless that person was indeed someone who is a shooter. And so when 10 guys are going into the House of Correction for a gun, and 9 of them are coming out and committing harm, I'm not held accountable for that. We have this weird thing that we do where we ask the question, all right, if you divert 10 guys, and 5 of them succeed, but 5 of them don't, why are you doing that? And that, again, is just a return on investment question. What we know, not because law school or lawyers talk about it or law enforcement knows or thinks about it in this way, but the best thing that we can do for most young people is just bounce them out of the system. Most of them will never come back. Early intervention is something that we should be doing. We should be doing them in schools. I hear a really, really good question in schools about this. And the public education system, I think, can participate in this new movement by understanding their power, their access to power, and the fact that the epicenter, the place that we lose most of our kids, is in school. That has to do with looking at your school discipline policies. That has to do with understanding the hiring, recruitment, and training of school resource officers. That has an understanding what your faculty looks like and what they're trained in. Because if you have a a person who's coming from a nonprofit like Teach for America, for example, taking a well-intentioned, really, really good, hardworking person. You stick them in this school district where they have no life experience dealing with young people from that school district. That's actually a lot of harm being caused. And so, really thinking about working hand in hand in a much more integrated way with our team, with our school, with the objective of keeping the kid in the school and recognizing again from that place of humility, like school was never validated to be like a successful thing. We like to think about it that way, but there's no like data that shows us that the best way to make safe, smart children is to stick them in a building for 7 hours a day, looking straight ahead at a class at a chalkboard, and getting straight A's in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Like it works out for lots of people. It worked out for me. But the fact that it doesn't work out for many more people than it does should tell us that the system needs to change, not the kids. Uh, yes, I'm seeing a lot of restorative practices in here. Um, how do you even start to have prosecutors understand the impact of decisions are on youth? How do you combat when they state that race never enters into their decision? Um, I don't know that I don't know that I combat that. It's a really interesting thing that we do, and I understand why. It doesn't feel good to acknowledge that race enters our decisions, but we can't look at the outcomes of our cases and say that race doesn't enter our decisions unless we fundamentally believe that those disparities are caused by actual differences in our skin color. Uh, you don't get to have it both ways. That we don't look at it, but these disparities exist for some other reason than we're looking at it. And it's also an interesting thing we do. It doesn't feel good to say it out loud, but most of it is unconscious. And so one that should liberate us from like this thing that we do that's like, no, we don't consider it. That's silliness. You don't have any control over it. It is unconscious. It is understandable, and frankly, it's child abuse. Like we were brought up in a country that, from the time that we are born, floods us with images and narratives about different races, and we eat that. From the time that we are 0 to 3 years old, all the books that we're reading, all the content, all the cartoons that we're watching, we learn 98% of the stuff that we will take through life in those 3 years. And so, unless you are doing very, very intentional work every single day to not let that happen, you don't get to opt out and say, no, I don't consider that. It is a language that we learn, and I use that specific language. It is a language that we learn to express as much as I can. It is not your fault. It is your fault if you see these disparities and you are unwilling to allow for the possibility that it might be something internal about you that all we're asking you to do is work on. And we're not asking you to work on it because we want you to feel bad and shitty about it, but because the more that we have racial disparities, the more that I live in a state like Pennsylvania where the African American population is 10%, but when I go into any prison, the African American population is 90% in those prisons. We are losing trust of our victims. And how do we know that we're losing trust of our victims? There's a whole data set in the Department of Justice right now from a victim survey that the Trump administration did in 2017. And what did we learn? 60% of crime victims of violent crime do not pick up the phone to call us. And of the remaining 40%, I want you to think about, particularly the prosecutors in the room, I want you to think about how many of those people are gone after the arraignment, before the grand jury, and certainly before trial. And we can look at that data, and we can put all of the blame on victims, we can put it all on snitch culture, we can put it all on lots of things, but unless we are okay with the status of our institution, we have to have the ability, the emotional intelligence, to have some accountability about that. And that accountability will bring trust. It will lend trust. Are restorative practices involved in cases with youth? I hope so. Restorative practices, to me, is the future. That is what we should be doing. To me, like I'm not a math person. I think about the times I use math now in my life, and I think about why Mrs. Burnside in the third grade was raking me over the coals because I wasn't like killing it at long division. Um, but why aren't we talking about conflict resolution in elementary school through restorative practice? And I use that example because there are lots of schools who have chosen to teach conflict resolution through restorative practices in children, and lo and behold, what happens? Increased graduation rates, increased attendance, all of the unintended intended consequences that you would want to. And then when you talk about restorative practices in the adult sphere, I saw restorative justice for the first time actually happening inside of a prison, and uh, it was the first time that I felt like a prosecutor because I saw someone being accountable for something. I saw a man who had killed another man saying the words under his own volition about what he had done and describing what he had done. It wasn't because of a plea bargain. It wasn't because I'd convicted him at a trial. It was because had been involved in this program, something he had been denying for years. But as soon as he was in this restorative justice program, he found the tools to do it. I saw a victim being able to ask that person questions that our system doesn't allow for, and to actually have human moments between those two people, which led to what? Safety. And so restorative practices has a bad brand, and I understand why. Like in that very event where I saw restorative justice, like when I walked in, I was like, I'm not about this. And I'm really glad I pushed through because I saw what I ultimately now train lots of prosecutors on is the value, the potential of this system. Mr. Condon asks, do you have a jurisdiction that you have looked at that you say they're doing it right, a jurisdiction that you would tell others to emulate? We're not. I mean, we're not there yet. There's not a system where I'm like, they're doing it right. There are lots of systems. There are lots of jurisdictions that are taking the first step of addressing a problem, which is acknowledging the problem. I think of Ramsey County, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, where not only is the leadership making that acknowledgement, but they're also collecting a lot of data to get their arms around the problem. We can't fix what we can't see, and a lot of us are afraid of data because we're afraid that it'll tell us a bad story, and we're just fooling ourselves if we believe that it's data that's keeping the secret hidden. Ramsey County has invested a lot in data, and it gives us targets to shoot at, and we can treat those targets as incentivizing behavior. It's not about shaming people and firing people. It's like, all right, well, let's get this data point up, or let's get this data point down, and let's see what happens. We're creating the opportunity for us to step into our power and privilege and be more like diagnostic problem solvers than robotic case processors. And so I think, Mr. Condon, the acknowledgement, the accessing the data and understanding the problem is we're getting there. The next step I think we need to see are jurisdictions who are willing to invest the time in their people. And what I mean by that is we have there are a lot of jurisdictions now in your state, and it literally does not matter sort of what traditionally, historically, the political party or the political persuasion of those states are. There are lots of jurisdictions that have come to this realization that there's a problem. It's really hard for us as lawyers not to acknowledge that there's a problem. And so we have knowledge of the problem, but we want to jump right to strategy and structuring around that problem. But we skip over this really important point, which is like insight. We need to like learn lots of things. We need to learn about the depth and the impact. We need to unlearn a lot of things, and that requires investment in your people, and that requires time. And so the longer answer to your question that I'm sure that you're just like sitting back and listening to all of this is recognizing that the hamster wheel is going to continue to run until we break it. And breaking it is going to inconvenience people. It's going to mean that people are stressed out. It's going to mean that people might get mad at you. Judges might be mad at you. Clerks might be mad at you. I understand intimately how inertia is really in the way, and relationships that are built around that inertia are really problematic when it comes to investing in time in your people. But you have to. We have to find ways to give people the amount of training. We have to give time to people to have wellness. Something else that we don't dare talk about in our system is the fact that like seeing all of this devastating shit all of the time has an effect on us as well. And if we're not aware of it and we're not treating it, we develop maladaptive traits to preserve ourselves. And so those two, like investing the time in our folks to solve the problem is where we need to get. And if you are the jurisdiction that is ready to make that time investment, I have a incredible training program that I give away for free. Do you talk to kids individually if someone contacts you? Yes, all the time. Please do. How can I help? How can we help youth deal, if not overcome the snitch culture, so they can empower themselves to ask for help when they see something that's wrong? Yeah, I mean, snitch culture is real. It is something that is true, not just of kids in the justice system, but like think about the ways that we're socialized as people. It's like, don't be a tattletale. That's something I remember hearing when I was a little kid. Nobody ever called me a snitch, but it was like, don't be a tattletale. It is something that we are conditioned to believe, and I understand. But there are ways to offer young people an off ramp that doesn't immediately lead to us going out and do something about it. Restorative justice is honestly, restorative circles, restorative practice is a really great way to cut away at snitch culture because it doesn't result in action to remediate whatever that person told you. It gives people an opportunity to say the things that they want to say to each other in a setting that is not one that is meant to end in somebody getting punished and shamed and canceled. It is one that is restorative and regenerative and one that's meant for repair. Another thing is like technology. There are ways, lots and lots of ways that Code for America, Silicon Debug, Recidiviz, some other organizations are using technology to allow for young people to participate in the justice system in lots of ways, and that one of them is violence interruption. And so jurisdictions that have violence interrupter programs that are an app-based alert system where I can alert a violence interrupter that there might be conflict, and that violence interrupter can show up at that conflict and resolve the conflict before it becomes a homicide is the way that we think about reducing the snitch culture. And Rainisha, that rolls up into that like Cure Violence, I think is a good program. It's a great start. But until we really like put the resources in it, we tolerate failure. It's one thing that's really hard for us to talk about is our tolerance of failure. But we're not going to get anywhere if we are going to pull back the reins every time that there's a failure. Not going to do it. We have a toxic relationship with failure, and I understand it's even more complicated for us because failure often means it costs someone their life or their liberty. But we're operating in the best light possible. We're operating in a 70% failure rate now. And so the question should not be, how do we get from 70% failure rate to perfect? It should be, how do we get from 70% failure to 50%? And study that and learn it and then make it better and try it again. That's how medicine has gotten to the point that it is now. That's how the airline industry has gotten to the point where it is now. We need to have that humility and that ability. K. Matthews. Jenny, if you want to just give me a time check just so we can know when it's best to hop over, that would be great. K, doesn't the fact that every law, every rule, every regulation has been built and primarily enforced by people who were privileged in centuries and decades of indoctrination, how can that be undone and make a difference in lives now? One is just saying that out, like acknowledging that actually is empowering because we realize like, wait a minute, human beings did all this. Like, these aren't rules and laws and regulations because we've vetted them, we've researched them, we've funded them, we've tested them. They're just rules that we wrote in lots of places hundreds of years ago. And just by pausing and thinking about that, really sort of like empowers us to write new ones, break those ones, um, try different things, look for analogs, and be inspired by the fact that like that is the truth. If the laws were written by a bunch of like really smart and current people, fueled by science and research and data, informed by impacted people, and we still had this mess, I would feel pretty helpless. But the fact we have this mess because we still have all those rules actually is empowering. I have adapted an evidence-based anti-bullying restorative justice circle, and it was amazing. Empathy shows instead of snitch culture. I love restorative circles can be utilized. So Andrew was offering a comment, which I love. If you don't know Andrea, please reach out to her. Um, it's really interesting having grown up in the community that I did and working as intimately as I did with young people in gangs, that we don't ever call what young people go through in their the really difficult thing that they have to put up with and staying out of a game as bullying. Uh, we never talk about it that way, and that again, we have to think about why do we call this in one community bullying, but in this community we call it, recruiting, grooming. Um, and so it's really great to hear that you have that, and it's really great to hear that you're using RJ. And I hope that the folks who are out there who are skeptical of RJ can just throw into the chat what it is about restorative justice that makes you resist it. What is it about um, progress that makes you hesitate? Um, are there people on the line who are willing to offer up why they think the system is working for us and why we actually should be heading in another direction where we should be uh, less empathetic, less compassionate, doing less of this work? Is there an effective way to give cops the autonomy to implement RJ, expand discretion, or is it always better than the prosecutor post-arrest realm, or what's the best balance? Jake, that's a great question. Amber already put in two resources that I would point you to, which are in Philadelphia. Um, but I would even like uh, there, if you cross from police to prosecutor, you're talking about some time and some interaction and some contact with the justice system. And we know, again, going back to one of my earlier comments, the best thing that we can do is just bounce a kid out as early as possible. And so I would love to see law enforcement. In fact, I grew up in a neighborhood where law enforcement did this shit all the time, where they exerted that discretion and power to implement RJ ideas or to divert cases. They have that discretion that was better for everyone because most of the time you never saw that kid again. You bring him home, you have a conversation with the family, done. Restorative justice also because of, and this is what I really would encourage the police to engage in it. One of the funniest things that I think about all the time is when I started bringing prosecutors into the prison where I saw restorative justice for the first time, so we can sit down and learn from men and women who are committing violence how to solve the problem. A lot of the incarcerated people reflected, oh, prosecutors are human beings too. And so there's like this mutuality of humanization that goes on that we don't talk about enough in restorative justice, but it really gives officers the opportunity to be human beings with young people outside the context of an interaction in the street. And when you move the interaction from that hot moment out in the street to the more controlled environment of restorative conversations, the dialogues are just fundamentally better. The outcomes, therefore, are fundamentally better. And like, I don't know if it's cool to say in here, but it feels better. Like I was shit-faced for the first 3 years of my job, and I don't shy away from sharing that with you. Because for me, it was something that I had to articulate, and I want other people to understand and articulate that is because I was self-medicating. The vision I had of being the good guy and locking up the bad guy and making victims whole was completely blown away when I started doing the job, and I wasn't prepared for that, and I was self-medicating. And so the data around suicides in the homes of law enforcement officials, domestic violence in the home of law enforcement officials, child abuse in the home of law enforcement officials. We shouldn't look at that and impugn the officers who are engaged in that conduct. We should impugn a culture and a system that allows for police officers to see gnarly things all the time and never have the opportunity to decompress, to talk about those things, to seek and get help and not feel like you're being judged or evaluated as somehow you're less safe of an officer. In fact, you have much more emotional intelligence, and therefore I want you out on the street. Beating our chests and saying this stuff does not affect us is what leading to violence. And so, Jake, I really, really love your question. Would love to think about working with you locally on that. What are your opinions on this country's zero tolerance policy of youth? If any one of us had a zero tolerance policy in our lives, we love to we do this thing where we look back at our life and we think about how great we are, and we think about the one or two times that maybe we screwed up, but we made it through because of our hard work and dedication. But we don't. Again, it's like can we all just acknowledge that we never would have made it here if there were zero tolerance policies for anything in our lives? I went to UMass Amherst, the University of Massachusetts Amherst. It's our biggest state school. It was called ZooMass at the time because it was a zoo. I saw more physical violence, sexual violence, drug abuse, drug sales, theft, intellectual property, fraud, and cheating in college than I ever did when I was a prosecutor in the Roxbury Division of the Boston Municipal Court and the Suffolk Superior Court. Ever. And if there's a zero tolerance policy at UMass for kids who were screwing up, or if there was like a six tolerance policy for kids screwing up at UMass, UMass would be empty. And so we just have to call that out and recognize it. And that's okay. It's okay that kids at UMass are screwing up and doing all those things because it's actually pretty natural and normal. It is very natural and normal. And we've created these environments to allow for kids to have those experiences. In fact, a lot of us understand that part of the cost of going to college is just to have the experience because we learn and we grow from that. We also know that at the end of that experience, I'm going to hand you a degree, and you are immediately going to be more valuable to the society, and you're immediately going to be less likely that you commit that harm again. And so giving that benefit to kids who go to places with schools with zero tolerance policies, and particularly recognizing that the recipients of the worst parts of our zero tolerance policies aren't even the people who they were created for in the first place. So as a really quick history lesson, zero tolerance policies showed up as a result of, anybody want to throw it in the chat? Anybody know when zero tolerance policies really took this country over? They happened because of a certain event in schools. Be brave, throw it in the chat. I don't want to be sitting here talking the entire time. Columbine. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gwen. Columbine. We put zero tolerance policies in school because we wanted to stop people from coming into schools with assault rifles and grenades and killing our children. We thought that Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris were throwing up warning signs about how they're going to come and shoot up the school. And on the first time they did something, we should have kicked them out. We could have prevented the school shooting. And since then, we've had several school shootings every year. Haven't prevented one of them. But what we have done is created a pipeline for children. Yes, there is a racial disparity and a tremendous one. There is a tremendous gender disparity that happens because of the school to prison pipeline. But also the thing that we don't talk about is kids with special needs and LGBTQ kids are part and parcel of the unintended consequence of zero tolerance policies. And so to answer your question, I don't feel very good about them. And I don't really understand the value to them or the ROI on them at school. If I have a kid who does something that I don't like in school, I'm going to kick them out because I have a zero tolerance policy. And because I've kicked them out, I've actually increased the likelihood that they're going to commit harm. I've not solved the problem. I've just moved it somewhere else. It's a water balloon. And I deeply and intimately understand, and we shouldn't be asking teachers to put themselves in jeopardy. But can we get some people in a school that aren't sitting in a classroom, that are meant to and work with kids who are showing up to school feeling all types of way because of the trauma that they're having in their homes, and recognize that a lot of the behavior that manifests in school is actually due to that trauma? And when we do that and just see what happens when we're keeping that kid in school, having the patience and the resources to keep that kid in school, we will save ourselves a lot of time, a lot of money, and probably lives if we do that. I see you, Molly. Yes, Gwen. Wait, I'm missing a lot of questions here. Do you have additional examples of how you use your sword and your shield? I have hundreds. Really quickly, let's just do this little razzle dazzle again. All right. So we kind of glazed over this one, and this is severely outdated. But this is I like to think about this collage, and it should be a lot bigger, as my scoreboard. And so Stanley is a great story. The people underneath Stanley, the two very, very handsome young men dressed in. I push them all back out into the world. I work with them in the community, and by I work with them, I mean I referred them and connected them to services, and then just monitored them. And as a result, when I look at that scoreboard, I have to ask myself, not should I stop doing that because this kid died and this kid's reincarcerated. Um, the question is, what would my scoreboard look like if I had just done what I was told to do and sent them all to prison? What would my scoreboard look like now? So, um, and there's lots and lots of other stories. There are stories that I can't even tell because I bumped them out and they never came back again. I don't know what happened to them, but I never saw them again in my jurisdiction, ever. And once in a while, there's like a beautiful return on that investment because I'll run into them in the most bizarre places, or I'll get a note from them. Somebody sees me speaking or whatever. It's fantastic, and that's the drug that I now sell. I was told that the paradigm of a win, the best that I will feel as a prosecutor, is in a case involving violent crime where I can take the person who's hurt the victim and send them to prison. I was told that that win will make me feel good and that will sustain me, and that was a lie. That win lasted for about 30 seconds because I turned to my victim would be like, "Wait, that's it? That's that's it?" And then I turned to the defendant, and the defendant would be going into prison, thinking about his appeal, thinking about all the things he could do to get out. And I'm looking behind me, and there's just two families that have been destroyed. The return on that investment and all of these young men to have them still in my life is better than any win that I could possibly even explain to you. And I'm still doing my job as a prosecutor because we're safer. Let's see here. Yep. A lot of questions about trust. How do we maintain trust when we have mandatory reporting and they don't want to be removed? That's a tough one, Jalissa, right? Like mandatory reporting is, again, we go back to those rules. Uh, and, we have a very litigious country. And so a lot of the rules that we have, a lot of the reasons that we do things, like I remember working with my juvenile probation officers who were just like dragging kids down for technical violations. And they were really good POs. Like I loved them. But every time there was this ticky-tack violation, they were issuing the notice and they were sending it, and we were having a hearing. And I was like, what the hell? What, like, why are you doing that? And they're like, we have to. It's the rule. Um, and so that, like, I don't know. Uh, I don't know the answer to this important question. I feel like the answer is somewhere in between, in between, um, like sitting down and talking to leadership, uh, drafting MOUs, memorandums of understanding that some people here are mandatory reporters and some people aren't. Like I worked in an institution that is rife with distrust. Like we're adversaries. And prosecutors, I'm a black prosecutor with dreads, like black kids in my courtroom. I'm the least trustworthy person to them. Uh, and theoretically, if they disclosed to me information that was going to hurt them, I would have to use that against them. That's part of my job. But I just drafted a document that said, if this all goes to shit, this case goes to somebody else, and I don't share that information with them. We have to be creative about dealing with the rules that are creating these boundaries because the benefit of having mandatory reporting, which I'm not taking lightly, and understand the benefit. But the benefit that we get for the cases where we have to be mandatory reporters at the cost of the trust of young people, we have to revisit it and ask, is this the best policy? Is this the best way to go about it? But we can't do that if we don't want to acknowledge there's a problem, then sit down collectively as a group and try to understand a better version. Did Stanley maintain contact with his mom? What happened to her? So again, thinking about your cases less as individual defendants and victims and thinking about them more as a doctor would, like patient zero and all the people around them. Part of my intervention in Stanley's life was one, getting an interpreter so I could speak with his mom, and two, it was getting her connected to some services herself. And very shortly after I met Stanley, she was working, and as a result of that relationship building with her, she made a stable enough home so that, sorry, it's the grand reveal. Um, she had a stable enough home so that when Stanley's brothers got out of prison, they were able to come there. Um, but we also got to celebrate Stanley's achievement together. And when Stanley um, when Stanley comes home from break, I get to give him a little bit of cash so he can buy his mom some groceries. Like it all the investment in Stanley continues to benefit his mom, continues to benefit his family, and that ecosystem is something that we can participate in and build. We become case managers and social workers. A lot of this is just recognizing the resources that are in your community And if this is the only time for the prosecutors and the police that you are interacting with all the other people who are on this call that don't wear a suit to work or don't wear a uniform to work, then stop doing that. We should be connecting all the time. And again, that goes back to the comment that I made earlier about leadership, realizing that strategic planning and meeting and building and being creative is going to yield much better outcomes than being on the hamster wheel and preparing my cases to get ready for trial to go to, like, we have to be more creative than that. How do we get a system change as a whole? Where do we start in trying to make things better for youth and families? Recognizing that youth are eventually going to become parents. And so as early as we can get them and as much as we can do to really do what everybody else, like, people are privileged. People just put up these barriers. They keep us alive. They keep us out of jail. Again, I think about my experiences at UMass. Like, people were just keeping up the barriers so that we could get across those thresholds. And so if you imagine a series of thresholds as points on a map, that if the kid gets over it, we've increased safety. If a kid gets into high school, we've increased safety. If they stay in high school, if they attend a certain number of hours a day, if they access pro-social activity for a certain number of hours a week, if they're living in stable housing, and they get to stay in that stable housing for X number of nights out of a year, there are metrics of success that we can look at and shoot at, and we should be. But we can't do it if we're just looking at the kid. We have to do it by understanding and asking hard questions of the people around them. And this is where the analog to the healthcare industry comes in. There's a startling study again this year that black newborn children are 3 times more likely to die if they're attending doctor as a white person. And that's not because doctors are objectively racist. It's not because they're bad people, but it's because we're just not dealing with the unconscious bias that we have. And so they studied, like, the difference between the black doctors and the white doctors, and what they learned was the black doctors church about sports, about food, about sleep. And as a result, by asking those questions, not about the baby, but of the family around them, they preserve the lives of those babies. And so understanding that that dynamic is really, really important. And it can't just be thinking about how do we change the families that are coming into our systems. We have to think about how we change our families. And so this is like the personal part for me. I'm really glad that you are all at this conference and you're hearing these words and you're sharing these resources, but we really need to, like, turn around and share them with our children. We do this thing in this country, and I grew up in a place that did this a lot, where we shield our children from the truths about our history, about how we got to where we are. And I understand all of the reasons that we do that, both the conscious reasons that we do that and the unconscious reasons that we do that. And we think that we are preserving our children's innocence or their virtue by not providing them with a full landscape of what's happening in our country, when in actuality we're being really disrespectful in this country. Allow our children to imbibe all of the content that they do in the way that it has been created and designed, and expect that they will just be able to choose not to be racist. It is a lesson, it is a language that is taught to us since the day that we were born. And it is not taught to us in a way that is overt and sinister. Obviously, we're not having our kids watch hateful television, but 80% of children's books out there, the protagonists of those books, the kids who have the most amount of value or cool or skill, are white kids. 80%. The next biggest demographic of protagonist characters in children's books are animals. Then the next biggest demographic, and I'm talking about like 8% of children's books protagonists, are Latinx people, and then black people. And so it just happens in this way that none of us really think about. Because when I was watching all the Disney movies and never seeing a black person, I was loving the Disney movies. I didn't care that I didn't see a black person. But the result was my seeing value in life as the heroic white people that I saw all of the time. And so we have to do the hard thing, which is having these conversations with our children. And the last thing I'll say on this point is if you think about racism and anti-racism as a language, and you remove from it all this bullshit that we do around it being like, I'm not a racist, I'm not bad, or you are a racist, you're like, that is a setup. It's a lie. Racism is a language. I don't tell people who speak Arabic or Spanish that they're bad people because they speak those languages. It is a language that we learn. And for any of you who chose the pandemic to try to learn a new language, I don't have to tell you how hard it is to learn a new language when you're an adult. But I also spent this weekend with a 1-year-old who has been learning Vietnamese and American Sign Language from the time she was born, and she's already fluent in both of those languages. And so if we do the hard thing, which is allowing for children to hear this information and giving them the respect that they are resilient enough to hear it and not feel bad about themselves, that it will actually be generative and adaptive for them. It will increase the value of their lives and the diversity of groups and ideas and challenges and relationships that they come up with. Then a lot of this work will be much easier for us when we get to adulthood. Thank you, Renisha. Thank you, Andrew, for your comments. I think we are about out of time, and if we're not exactly there, I'm going to give you back a couple minutes so I can get a cup of coffee, and then I will see you all in breakout room number 2. Grab your friends, grab your families, grab whoever you want. We're going to go over there, and we're going to continue this dialogue, and we're really going to frame the conversation around the healthcare system and what the healthcare system did to improve their outcomes. But yes, please stick around to view what Amy said. We'll see you soon.